I have Dr. Abby Hafer joining me today. Dr. Abby Hafer, welcome to Truth Wanted.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. So those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Hafer, she is the author of The Not So Intelligent Designer, Why Evolution Explains the Human Body and Intelligent Design Does Not. And also has a doctorate in zoology from Oxford University and currently teaches anatomy and physiology at Curry College. So in case you haven't gotten it by now, she knows a lot of stuff, okay? A lot more than me about very relevant things to this show. So I'm very excited to talk with Dr. Hafer today. Honestly, the problem that we found while figuring out what to talk about was, where do we start? Because you talk about so many things that are of interest to us. If you could, tell us some of the more recent projects you've been working on.
Okay, well, the project that I'm working on more or less right now is I am helping CFI put together an amicus brief for the Supreme Court about abortion. You probably know that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case about abortion. And I just kind of thought that there ought to be a scientific voice in that, and nobody asked me. But on the other hand, it does turn out that CFI, Committee for Inquiry, for Skeptical Inquiry, is doing an amicus brief, and I asked if I could help out with that, and they were happy to have me add a scientific viewpoint to that. Please note, I am not in charge of this brief, so I'm not going to control what they finally wind up submitting. I'm just trying to help out with some science.
Yes. So for those who are living outside the country or listeners of the show, there has been, this is honestly, this conversation has never stopped. But, recently there's been like some big moves in this conversation between, pro-choice and pro-life folks, right? A lot of legislation has been trying to be passed in the past couple of years, including in Texas here, something that's going to be starting in September that definitely needs to be challenged, about people's rights to abortions. And it's relevant to this show because the biggest people who are proponents of taking away those rights are evangelical Christians. At least they're a huge, huge part of the reason why we see the laws that we do today. And so when we talk about, okay, why do we even want to talk about issues like this? Why even talk about religion? Why does it matter if other people believe things and you don't? Okay, this is a big reason why it matters. Because even if you aren't involved in this kind of stuff, if activism is not your thing, there are going to be laws that affect you that people who do care are going to be writing and fighting and trying to change every single day. And so it's really important that we have people who are talking about these issues and who are really informed about these issues so that we can fight back to make sure that we can retain those rights for everybody that's involved. And it does involve everybody. It does involve everybody to some degree. Even people who don't have the ability to get pregnant, it's still going to matter in the lives of family members and things like that. So very big stuff, very big deal. So what are some of the, what's some of the work you've been doing on this amicus brief?
Okay, well, as I said, this is mostly a matter of putting in the stuff where science actually has something to say about this. So, one of the things that I bring up is that you cannot murder a molecule. DNA is given an almost mystical quality by a lot of people. And between you and me, a lot of it is a matter of substituting in some sort of placeholder for the soul, which is, of course, a religious idea, but it's almost like a God of the gaps kind of a thing. It's like when they say, where does life begin, or life begins at conception? What they're saying in code is that the soul starts at conception. That's what it's code for. And so there's a lot of sort of woo around DNA. And the fact of the matter is that DNA is a molecule. It's made out of 4 nitrogenous bases, some phosphate, and a sugar called deoxyribose. That's really all it is, and you cannot, I repeat, murder a molecule. There are other fun things about the whole life begins at conception thing because,
Right.
first of all, it doesn't begin at conception. It began quite a few billion years ago, and it's been life ever since.
Right.
So, there's a whole lot more I can say about that. We could do a whole show on this,
Well,
but you may want to get onto other stuff as well.
I mean, really, no, I am interested in talking about this because one, I am a like cis het dude who, doesn't have really the credentials to really talk about this. And this is something that I've looked into and had conversations with, but haven't had really conversation on air about. So I'm really glad that we're talking about this here. Because again, this history of this political movement of making these changes to these laws goes back way before I was born. And all the way back to the 60s and 50s, when early evangelicalism as we see it today was starting to arise, and people were kind of making these shifts. A lot of people didn't actually care about this issue historically, at least in this country, until you see this time period of people really pushing it into the mainstream. So it's really, really fascinating to see, because again, this isn't something that's completely universal to the world at large, and the framing of this issue is really, really critical, because like you said, people are talking about the souls of babies, right? Like we're killing babies when we're talking about these conversations of protecting the rights of people to have abortions. And that's never been the case. That's not what people are talking about. It's a much more complex issue than that. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, and just again, like what the nature of your work is doing here.
Okay, well, as I said, I'm busy trying to put together basically the physiological information about this.
Yeah.
So, and I'm kind of trying to do it from the standpoint of, let's talk about some irrefutable truths here. So, as I said, things like you can't murder a molecule, and I'm going to add, abortion opponents will often say, well, a unique individual is made at conception. Well, actually, the science of epigenetics tells us that that is not a unique individual, that in fact, many different individuals might come out depending upon which genes are expressed and how. So, as I said, it's not just, one thing happening there. But another far more important matter, as far as I am concerned, is that we need to acknowledge that time exists. That seems pretty obvious to you and me. But time exists, and this matters in physiology. And religious people often feel that they speak in terms of timeless truths, that what is true today was true 500 and 5,000 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to your physiological state, time really matters. And your state right now, Dan, is very different from your physiological state in, say, 200 years, because time matters in physiology. And just to sort of bring this home a bit more, I am not going to refer to you as an undead corpse.
Okay. I mean, you can if you want to, I guess. That sounds kind of metal.
I mean, it's physically true and all, but the point is that abortion opponents refer to zygotes as unborn babies or unborn individuals or unborn genetically unique people, and persons is what they often say, unborn persons. I've had to read too much of this stuff. Anyway, so unborn persons, as if being born is the important part. And let me tell you right now, the physiology of gestation is far more important than just leaving the uterus. But as I said, before we even get to that, as I said, unborn persons, as though they are a complete person who's just like sitting there waiting to be born, as if time didn't exist. And as I said, you, again, under that kind of talking about things, could be referred to as an undead corpse, which you might think is cool. But the point is, the way that I treat you now, the way you may legally be treated by anybody, is very different depending upon whether you're alive or whether you're a corpse.
Mm-hmm.
So if I refer to you as an undead corpse and you have all the rights of a corpse, that means I can bury you now. And I don't think you would appreciate that.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And if, if a pregnant person is murdered, for instance, we don't typically consider that a double homicide, on the same
Right.
token, right? It is kind of this weird conversation. And I think it's one of the things that, people who argue against abortion rights will point out. It's like, well, they tried to put the onus on you to say, okay, well, where does a human being begin? Right? Where do we get to draw this line? And, it's really a complicated question. I'm wondering if you could speak to how you would respond when people bring up this point.
Well, actually, I mean, that actually starts becoming a more interesting question because I think that it is intellectual laziness that has people saying, basically life, quote unquote, begins at conception. What they mean is they don't want to draw the line. So
Okay.
they are just being lazy and cowardly. They don't want to draw the line. They don't want to think about it. They're going to make that somebody else's problem. Now it's officially any woman's problem. And as you said, all of the men in their lives as well.
Yeah.
So, where you draw the line is a much more interesting question. And I have had some women argue that you draw the line when there is an air gap between the woman and the baby. Most people argue for what is called viability. That is to say, when it would be possible for a fetus to live outside of the uterus. But even that's a little bit shaky, just from the standpoint of you would not actually recommend, if you say, well, you can't have an abortion after viability. Well, first of all, why not? And does that mean that it would be all right then to induce labor at that point and deliver the baby and, have it adopted out or whatever? Because if that's not what you mean, then that's being disingenuous as well. But you will notice that the science of all of this is rarely talked about. I'm going to bring up one thing right now, however, because this is another thing for people to know. A heartbeat is a lousy way of figuring that out. Because, and this is something that's truly wonderful about biology, individual heart cells beat all by themselves. And I am telling you this from personal experience. I've had lots of interesting jobs. And at one point, I had a job looking at heart cells. So I would actually take hearts out of embryonic chicks and I would dissolve the connective tissue between the cells so that I would just have a nice little bunch of heart cells sitting in a Petri dish. And they were alive and happy and, had the nutrients they need and all. And as they were sitting there in that Petri dish, every now and then I had to count how many I had. And so I would look at them with a microscope. And when I was looking at them with a microscope, they were beating. It's what they do. Heart cells beat. That is to say, they contract rhythmically. It's just what they do. It's a part of their biochemistry. Now, I have to emphasize this. There was no brain there. There was no nervous system there. There was no organism there. They were individual heart cells that were beating because that's what heart cells do. And again, we have some very romantic ideas about hearts, which people have had really since ancient times. But in terms of figuring out something like abortion, you don't want to go the romantic route of saying, oh, it's a heartbeat, because a heartbeat really does not tell you anything about the individual other than that some of the heart cells are alive.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Not
definitely. The heartbeat stuff, that never made sense to me either. It's that's an involuntary system and doesn't really mean a lot in terms of the state of what a human being is, right? But I guess circling back to this question, because again, what we often talk about on this show is how to have conversations like this one with friends and family members who do believe in things that we don't, or vice versa. And so when people are bringing up this fact, like, okay, well, it's you have to draw the line somewhere, and you have to protect the innocent before they're born. Obviously, you even mentioned that viability can sometimes have problematic parts to their arguments. So, like, what's your general advice for people who are having these conversations with friends and family members who genuinely think you're in support of killing babies, right?
Well, I guess the other thing is you can talk about killing the innocent. Um, that's a very religious idea.
Mm,
That it's like that people walking around in the world are guilty, are not innocent, that they're sinful,
mm,
whereas an unborn baby is innocent. Um, and I would say that the people who want to have the abortion may well be just as innocent. That is to say, they haven't done anything wrong. If you want to argue that having sex is wrong, I think I'm very happy to argue against you.
mm,
Um, so, as I said, it's more of a question in many cases of what is the responsible thing to do. Um, if you have a whole lot of people, you have the two people, you have the woman who is pregnant, you have the father, if they know who that is, and so on. And they are living, breathing, whole people, whereas a fetus does not have feelings. Um, a fetus isn't a human being. It has maybe, possibly, the potential to become one, but it isn't one at that point. And just by the way of letting you know, abortion actually is natural. Um, Something like, I don't remember the exact number. I think it's around 31% of all fertilized eggs do not result in live births.
mm,
And some remarkable number, like 25%, um, fail to implant. So you have a fertilized egg that is going through sort of a few cell divisions, but there's this very, very important stage in the development of a zygote where it actually has to implant on the lining of the uterus.
mhm,
If it doesn't do that, it just washes out with menstrual fluid. And about 25% of all fertilized eggs fail to implant.
mhm,
So, again, if you want to get into the old God question or God conversation, do you really think that God creates all of these souls so that they can live about 10 days as undifferentiated masses of cells and only to then wash out with menstrual fluid? Um, that doesn't seem terribly godly to me. Um, and it also means that God, if you actually believe that God is in charge of things, it means that God is by far the world's busiest abortionist,
mm,
because these abortions are spontaneous. They just happen.
mm.
Um,
Oh, but
and if
Dr. Hafer, that's the result of sin in the world. That's not the Lord. That's our fallen nature.
But once you start no, but that's actually very useful, because once somebody says something like that,
Mhm,
they are no longer talking about secular law.
mm, yeah.
And so, as I said, you get them doing that, you can still have conversations with your family about that, and whether, you specifically should get an abortion depending upon what your personal beliefs are. But that is very different from what the law of the land is. Um,
Right.
and we supposedly have secular law in this country. And this is the pernicious thing, is that people will sort of have these ideas, as you said, about sin and one thing and another, and then they kind of try to dress it up in fancy language, in order to make it palatable for for law courts
Right. Right. Yeah,
and for
it's
legislatures.
yeah, like like I said, it all goes back to framing, right? About what this issue really is, and people often demonstrate it as some sort of particular moral failing of human beings. But you're right, like this is a process that happens naturally. Now, not to use a naturalistic fallacy, right? Just because it happens naturally doesn't mean it's a good thing, but it's
Right.
important to recognize that not only is this something that occurs, but also there are reasons that it occurs beyond what's within our control. So choosing to have more control over someone's bodies, in my opinion, is a moral good. Is something that's all everybody can benefit from if they're more informed about making these kinds of decisions for themselves. And because the truth is, people who lack sex education in this country, people where I grew up with, who are at the most risk of being oppressed by these laws in some ways, right? Because talking about Texas in particular, right? If this new legislation that is supposed to be taking effect in September is basically saying that you can't get an abortion after like 5 weeks, I think is what it is. It's a crazy small amount of time, because a lot of people don't even realize that they're pregnant within 5 weeks, but they're trying to make these, and they've always tried to make these really hard ways for people to get access to the care that they need in the first place. The Heartbeat bill making sure that people have to go in for a sonogram first before they can even get a procedure done and have to schedule a second appointment for. And on top of that, you have places in this country that are called crisis pregnancy centers that are not actual clinics where abortion procedures happen, but instead are basically traps for people to come in and hear a lecture on why abortion is bad and why it's wrong and why you shouldn't go through with it. So there's a lot of stuff in this country that, again, I think people outside the United States probably wonder what the heck is going on here. But yeah, it's a ongoing thing that just will not stop and will never stop unless people are making the rules to fight back and pointing out that, hey, we've already made this decision on a Supreme Court level. To go against that is going against a precedented law here. So before we move on with this conversation, I want to know, what can people at home really do about and talk about this? Obviously, we talked about what those conversations with friends and families might look like, but do you think that this is an issue that's ultimately going to have to be resolved through work with what you're doing through just legal grounds, or do you think it's a matter of changing the hearts and minds of people around you?
Well, I think it's all of that. As I said, or as you said, this has been a perennial issue for a very long time. It's a really good issue that conservatives have figured out that they can fundraise around, so they really like to keep going with it. But as I said, I think there's a bit more of a crisis right now, both because the Supreme Court is actually going to be considering abortion laws, and there's one group of essentially Catholic theologians who, again, have dressed up their thoughts in secular language, but that's just kind of a cheap suit. But basically claiming that any abortion, is unconstitutional. And so they are presenting this to the Supreme Court as a brief for the case that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear. And who knows how that's going to go, but it does mean that this is actually sort of, there may be a turning point here in national politics, which would be bad. In terms of the individual states, you've pointed out the problem really nicely, which is that, they keep chipping away at people's right to get an abortion. And by so doing, if they make it harder and harder and harder, not only does that mean that it's harder for any individual to get an abortion, but they're basically trying to run out the clock.
Yeah.
If you say, you can't have an abortion after 5 weeks. Oh, but first you have to have a doctor's appointment, and then you have to get an ultrasound, and then you have to do this, and then we'll send you to a pregnancy crisis center where you'll waste several days because you think you've got a doctor's appointment, but then it turns out all they're going to do is, hand you some pamphlets.
Right.
Given that it usually takes people a few weeks to realize that they are pregnant at all, it's not that hard to run out the clock. And that's a really evil and nasty thing to do to somebody. And that's what they're doing.
Right.
Now, this is why I think what we need in this country, and this could be done legislatively if Congress got brave, is there could be a Reproductive Rights Act. And you may have heard about the old Voting Rights Act back when it was actually useful and strong. Because basically back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of states that did a very similar kind of maneuver as we're seeing now with abortion, but they did it with voting rights. So they would make it harder and harder and harder for people, particularly poor people, particularly Black people, and so on, to register to vote, to find a place to vote. They would make all kinds of laws which they knew would be struck down in court, but in the meantime, they could be acted upon and they could prevent people for one election or two or this kind of thing. And if they just came up with, 30 or 40 laws like this per legislature per season, they could basically make it impossible to vote, even if most of the laws were bogus and would eventually, be struck down.
Right.
That's what they're doing with abortion now. So the old Voting Rights Act basically said that any states that had a bad track record that way had to clear their changes to voting laws with the federal Congress before they could actually enact those laws. This was known, I believe, as pre-clearance, but I'm not a lawyer. But anyway, basically, as I said, the states that had been pulling these games had to ask ahead of time if they could enact this law, and Congress was well within its rights to say, no, that's bogus. We need the same thing for abortion rights because, as you pointed out, states are busy making all of these laws, more or less daring people to strike them down. But that means putting together a lawsuit. It means paying lawyers. It means doing all this kind of stuff. And, people have lives to live and other things to do, and money is not endless and all of that kind of stuff. So, as I said, what we need, what would be great, would be a Reproductive Rights Act, where, again, the states that are bad actors would have to clear any new laws that they made about abortion with Congress before they were allowed to enact them. That would be sort of the ultimate end game, in my opinion.
Interesting.